When you're building those projects with wide glue-ups and you really want that cathedral grain or that central grain to be right in the middle of the panel, there's a couple alternatives we have. Yeah, we can buy those big wide pieces, but that's not always an option. We can buy thicker. Buy 8/4 stock and take it to the bandsaw, cut it down the middle, open it up, and you get a great pattern. This is called book matching. Here, this is a piece of ash. One thing that you'll note is that when you bandsaw it and you'll plane it, the grain pattern may shift a little bit. I like to cut my pieces a couple extra inches long, and then I can shift the board up or down to get as much of the grain structure to match as possible. Those panels could be resawn again to make a wider panel. It would be thinner, but if that will suit the need of our project, that may be a way to go. Here's just a couple pieces of veneer. It's the same thing with plywood. It was cut open to be book matched. The next piece can be folded and unfolded through a series of cuts, and we get a very consistent pattern across a project. It's another way that you can use the natural beauty of wood to enhance your woodworking project. The way that lumber grades are determined is how big of parts I can yield out of a larger plank. For example, I can get a nice piece right here and remove all the knots. Sometimes though, even though I may be able to get that material out of here, by the time I plane it down, because there's so much twisting, for example, that might be in a board, that by the time I join it and plane it down, some of the areas may not have all the mill marks removed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut, instead of cutting, say, a 60-inch board to get 3 drawer faces out of, I'm going to cut 3 20-inch pieces in a row. I'll mark them and index them so that I can keep them in line as I go through my milling procedure. It will allow me to yield more parts out of lower grade material. So let's see how I would go about making up those drawer faces. This board's pretty flat, but I still have the knots to deal with. So the first place I'm going to go is right to this knot. I'm going to move just a couple inches away till the grain straightens back out and draw a line on each side. Now I'm going to see what I can yield. I need 20-inch long drawer fronts, so I think I can get, I can get a couple on this side. But I run into a knot on this direction. Is that going to work for me? Normally I would say no, but remember, we're talking about drawer faces. Do you ever see the inside of the drawer face? Well, you might. If it's on a drawer with a detached face, where you have a drawer box and a separate front, when you put them together, you'll never see that inside area. Maybe I can use that to my advantage. When I flip the board over, the knot's gone. So, yeah, I will use that. The one thing I'll have to be careful of, when I'm going to use this surface on the jointer first. That way I can get this flat. I'll machine this face parallel. I'll have both sides be my consistent thickness, and then I'll take off the bad material through the planer the rest of the way down, trying to keep this side intact. I don't know how deep this knot is, so I'll have to watch for it in my machining process. Remember that nice piece of walnut I showed you earlier? It's air dried, it's absolutely gorgeous, but how do I take advantage of all the different things that are going on? The grain is all over the board. Well, I'm going to start at one end. Here I've got some nice straight grain structure that I can make rails and stiles out of that'll look really nice. This part of the board has some big wide cathedral grain, and it would make a great drawer front or maybe the side of a cabinet that has a raised panel. Coming down this way, I've got some sapwood that I need to get rid of, and I've got structure of grain that's kind of moving around, and I have this big defect. So how do I take advantage of this area? Well, let's say I'm making a little dresser with an arched rail at the bottom. I can use that grain to my advantage, and by placing that window over the project, I can search around until I find just the right grain structure. I've got a nice little area here. Oh, that one's real nice. I've got this grain line that really follows my arch. So I'll mark that out and utilize that section. Now this defect here, this is really a tricky area. I can always go to the bandsaw and cut a section out, but what if I want to get a straight section right here next to this knot and the split? This is going to be dangerous to run across the joiner because the board will be unstable and it would be unsafe to run through the table saw. So I can use a scrap of plywood, and what I can do is overhang the edge, drive a couple of screws, and now putting this edge up against my rip fence, I can rip parallel edge right off this board safely and accurately. Working with plywood presents some of the same challenges we dealt with when dealing with hardwood. We want to maximize the effect of the grain and take advantage of it for our use in our project. But it presents some other challenges. The material is large and heavy, sometimes more than 100 pounds a sheet, and can be very difficult and unsafe to handle through a table saw. So how do I deal with those challenges? The first thing I do is I think about the grain structure. You know, we can buy rotary cut plywood, like here in this door panel. It's great for a shop cabinet. Rotary cut plywood, the veneer is peeled off the outside of a log, and it lays out and it creates a very irregular grain pattern, but it makes great cabinet material for my shop. Slip matched or plain sliced plywood takes the plywood and cuts slices through the tree that creates structure in the grain that looks just like parts of a hardwood log that has been cut up and edge glued into a piece of plywood. Here I can take advantage of a joint line in the plywood to create some real drama, using that plywood to my best effect in my project. So if I have a large sheet, I need to select a grain pattern that I like for the part. Let's say I'm going to make a 12-inch wide, 6-foot long side for a bookcase. The first thing I need to do is figure out how wide I need to make my first rip based on the grain. But I'll also want to make sure I don't use the factory edge for my finished piece. So what I'll do is I'll cut the part about a 1/2 inch wider than I need it, and I'll take advantage of the table saw to true it up. So I'll cut it 12.5 inches wide on the floor, and then we'll go to the table saw and I'll show you how I clean it up and size it to its final dimensions safely. To break down the sheet, the first thing I do is I get a piece of 1.5 inch rigid insulation. I've cut it about 4 inches smaller in both directions than my sheet, and you'll see why. So I'll bring my sheet in and lay it on the foam. Now I can start selecting the grain and making the cuts using a circular saw and a couple of edge guides. The edge of the side starts about 10 inches from the edge. After marking both edges, I align my cutoff jig with one set of marks. To make a cutoff jig, just glue and screw a narrow strip of MDF to a second strip the width of your circular saw's shoe. Then run the saw against the narrow strip, trimming the wider one. Now, the edge of the jig shows exactly where the blade will cut. I like to use a 40-tooth finish blade to reduce chip out and set the depth of cut just deeper than the plywood thickness. You don't want to cut into the floor. A framing square helps me set the jig for cross-cutting the pieces to rough length. This doesn't have to be perfect. I'll true up the end on the table saw. I keep that 4-inch strip of foam that I took off the long edge of the plywood as a straight edge, a lightweight straight edge, to set my outfeed support. I set it slightly below the surface of the table, so if the material drops a little bit, it doesn't catch. Now I've got two pieces that are identically sized, and I've maximized my grain potential within that sheet of plywood.